This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Cal Newport. And Cal is writing on a really cool subject. Passion. How to find your passion. You hear it all the time, right? Go find your passion. Chase your passion. Cal comes at it from a different perspective. He comes at it from the perspective and how I have come to have the passions in my world. My passions are twofold. Starting out with trading, specifically trend following trading, and then also having this passion to teach other people and show them what I've figured out. But when I started both of those endeavors, I didn't wake up and say to myself, I'm so passionate about this today. I was motivated. I wanted to learn. I remember going through so much trend following material. And I remember early on, even though I had a few really important mentors, I remember early on it was devastatingly, not complex is not the phrase that I want to use, but it just didn't hit me. It just didn't hit me. So I've always been motivated to get people over the hump, so to speak, that I had. The hump of understanding. But my passion came after some success. The trading, the teaching, the success from those endeavors pushed me on the passion. The passion multiplied. It became exponential from success, from confidence. Just if you're sitting out there right now and you don't know what you want to do, and this conversation that I have with Cal Newport is for far more than just traders. It's for anybody, entrepreneurs, anybody that's trying to figure out how to get ahead. And it ultimately starts with deliberate practice. Cal's going to talk about that. And look, some people are going to listen to this podcast and they're going to go, and they're just going to be the typical doubting Thomas or, worrywart or anxiety or this or that conversation's useless to me. I'll guarantee you, anybody that thinks like that does not have their passion going in the right direction. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. The concepts that Cal put out there were just fantastic reminders from me. And it's after all the different experiences that I've seen, it's nice to see somebody go out and do massive amounts of research that kind of back up my trial and error process. Love that. Enjoy. Hey, Cal, how are you?
Doing fine.
Where am I reaching you today?
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. I will be in Washington, D.C. for the first time in a year come mid-December.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Well, my family is in the Virginia area, and I still own property in the Virginia area, so I will pop in from my Asia travel. So listen, I love your stuff, and I think you've hit upon an angle and a thought process that is really counterintuitive. And I'll explain my situation in a few minutes on why I related so much to where your work is going. But one of the things I wanted to bring up right out of the gate and let you run with it. So there's this philosopher, Alan Watts, who's no longer with us. Eastern philosopher. And he's got a very popular video that appears on YouTube that cites one of his speeches from the 1950s titled, "What If Money Was No Object?" And essentially, it's this great motivational pitch about following your passion. And I love it. However, he doesn't give the second part of it. It's the pitch about following your passion. What if money was no object? And I think for people that are not knowledgeable of your work and where you're going yet, it can leave them hanging in that kind of middle ground of like, I'm going to follow my passion. I'm going to follow my passion. But then they don't know how to do that. And it doesn't work out exactly. It doesn't work out exactly like they expect. Why don't I let you just jump in with the idea of following your passion and why that's not such a great idea from your perspective?
I think that's absolutely right. You see, the idea that you should follow the goal of ending up passionate about what you do is a very powerful idea. But exactly what is missing here is how do people actually end up passionate about what they do? And it turns out that this is a complicated story, but we don't tell it enough. So in the absence of this complicated story, people, especially young people who are in love with this idea of being passionate about what they do, fall back on simplistic strategies, such as if I just do enough introspection and figure out in advance what I want to do, everything will be perfect. And it's these simplistic strategies that fail and then cause the angst and the confusion and the uncertainty that is gripping more and more people today.
Well, let me give you an example of my situation. So in the mid-1990s, I came across a certain style of trading. At the same time, while getting into that, I also had the idea of teaching other people what I had learned. I didn't necessarily have a fantastic passion about it. It wasn't until, and your work made me realize this, it wasn't until after I had this success, once I started to sniff the success, that the passion started to become overwhelming.
The biggest misconception about passion is that it is something that pre-exists the actual work you do. And this is sort of the biggest misconception that I think is throwing people for a loop, is that in our popular culture, we think the strategy is you identify the passion first. It exists. You begin feeling incredibly passionate about something. And then all you have to do is direct this unbridled passion towards that work, and you'll love it from day one. Your experience is actually incredibly more common. When you actually study people who love what they do, you find out that, yes, passion is something that's very important, but it develops over time. And it's almost always not something that exists in advance of starting down that path.
Let me repeat something that I've seen in your work. The feeling that arises from having mastered a skill that earns you recognition and rewards.
Yeah, when you start thinking about passion as a side effect of running your career in the right way, it really changes the way you think about things. So if you actually step back and say, okay, here's 10 people, as I did research in my book, here's 10 people who are passionate about what they do. Why do they feel this way? What you almost always find is that it's the side effect of certain deeper traits, work non-specific traits that aren't tied to particular fields, such as recognition, such as impact on the world, such as a feeling of autonomy and connection to people, that the passion they feel is almost always a side effect of having these traits in their working life. But if you think about these type of traits, autonomy, impact, recognition, they're not tied to a specific type of work. There's no one field you have to discover in order to have these traits, which gives us a whole different way of thinking about passion that says it's not what you do so much as how you do it that's going to matter if you want to end up loving your work.
So anyways, let me give you my example. What I was, we were talking about passion. So a concrete example, my assistant, Michelle, and she comes back to me and I showed her some of your links to your work. And she immediately was like, her interpretation, and I want you to run with this, was like, well, if I'm good at something and I sink a bunch of time into it, but then I don't find out I like it. And I think she was fixated on the particular task and not the conditions of a lifestyle, perhaps.
Yeah, this is a mindset that's actually somewhat recent in the history of career thinking. It dates back to the mid-1980s. This notion that intrinsic match of the work to intrinsic inclinations or talent is what matters above all else. If you go back farther in the history of career thinking, you don't see this so much. You see much more emphasis on various virtues, generic virtues surrounding work. So what the example of your assistant, I think, illustrates well the problem with this mindset. It means that people are thinking, well, really, in the end, what's going to matter is whether this ended up being the right work for some sort of magic intrinsic inclination buried somewhere in my DNA or psyche. And this type of thinking, it can be really discouraging, because what happens is, as soon as something gets hard, as soon as you have to do a project that you don't necessarily enjoy, it starts nagging away at the back of your mind. It has you start thinking, well, maybe this wasn't quite what I was meant to do. So a big part of my work on this topic is to really push people away from the notion of intrinsic match. It's traits, non-work specific traits like impact, autonomy, recognition that lead people to love their work. The specifics of what you do really are not that important.
As you're explaining that, let me throw something else at you in that context. People come up against something that's hard. And in this day and age, there's a lot of messaging that says, well, you just don't worry, be happy. And I think a lot of people run from hard. What have you found in your work that if you press through? I think back to when I started, there was a lot of hard things. And I remember just spending inordinate amounts of time. And I know you have in your career too. And it's not necessarily while you're in the middle of that, is it's passion, but you need to, sometimes things are not so easy. And it's that overcoming, I think, is also part of getting towards your passion.
And it's important to flip around how you see hardness. I'm like many in your audience, I see things in a sort of quantitative, sort of economic framework. So let's apply that to this issue. So the idea that you're passionate about your work, the idea that you really love your work, that is a very desirable trait. Right? Lots of people would love to be really passionate about what they do for a living. So we have to assume that that's a rare and valuable trait. If you want the type of job that gives you that, it's rare and valuable. So basic economics tell us you have to have something rare and valuable to offer in return. Right? If something is scarce and people want it, then you can't just grab it. You actually have to earn it. So that feeling of difficulty, okay, I'm mastering a hard skill, for example, and it's hard and it's a pain. To use an example from my own life, I'm in graduate school and I'm in my second year and I'm just not good at stuff yet. And it's really hard. And these senior grad students are just so much better at this than I am. And I'm getting no, feeling of brilliance or reward at this point. That difficulty is something that you should embrace, because what you're doing is you're going through something hard. You're building up hard skills. You're raising the barrier of entry in some sense. I've put in hard work for this. It was very hard. A lot of other people aren't willing to do it. So that's good. I'm building up my capital in this career market. I'm doing the stuff that's going to make me more and more valuable, and therefore I can get more in return. So I flip it around. Embrace the feeling of something being difficult and hard, because that means you're moving in the right direction.
When you explain it this way, it's perfectly logical. And like I said, I feel like I've lived a lot of this in my life. But what was so nice about your words is that you were taking these life experiences that I've had, things that I've experienced, and you were kind of in a very concise, straightforward, easy to digest way laying them out. And I was just like, a moment. Perfect. I wish I would have written this.
It's true. If you talk to people, right, this is my experience, you talk to people who are passionate about their work. If you say, hey, just give me 10-second advice, what's your advice to me as someone who's like new in a career, they would say, yeah, follow your passion. But what they really mean is, hey, I'm passionate about my work and it's great, and that should be your goal as well. So then you say, well, let me just push a little bit harder. What was the first job you had out of college, for example? When did you first start getting down this track? And you push just a little bit harder, and they say, well, actually, you're right. No, I didn't know about this in advance, and I had this break here, and then I was working on this, and it turned to something else, and you get a whole much more complicated story. So it's almost as if the American career advice conversation has ended after that first 10 seconds. And as soon as we say, well, what's the next 10 seconds? And what's the 10 seconds after that? We start to get this way more interesting, complicated picture, something that can actually work.
Well, I 100% agree with that. And I think there are some things that I see happening in modern day society, things like LinkedIn, which for all intents and purposes are just ways to find jobs. They don't even approach really in the areas that you're going. Let me get you to a specific example in your work that I think might help people to wrap their arms around this even more. Chess. Why don't you talk about the work that you've done, the analysis that you've done at looking at top chess players?
chess provides a nice analogy for thinking about how people become good at what they do, how they build what I call career capital that allows them to craft these careers that they're very passionate about. And when you study chess players and study how they get good, you see that it is an act of deliberate work and deliberate practice. That the best chess players, if you look at the research, are those that don't just play a lot of games. It's those that actually do a lot of what they call serious study. They find out, where am I weak? Where do I not know how to do something well? And how can I stretch myself? How can I put myself in a situation where I'm forced to do this type of middle game or this type of opening or this type of strategy in a way that I'm not quite good at yet? And they hone in and deliberately stretch themselves to improve the skills. And it's the chess players who do that become really good. Well, I think a similar analogy holds for knowledge work. That if you want to be rapidly building up skills and then therefore able to take control of your career and make it something you're passionate about, you have to see it like the chess players. You have to be systematically straining specific abilities that you know are valuable. It's that type of effort that makes people stars in their field and gives them control. That sort of systematic straining effort.
Try and unwind that a little bit more for people. The systematic striving, the systematic aspect of gaining skill and deliberate practice. I know people can probably relate to Malcolm Gladwell's book that came out, and he talked about the 10,000 hour rule, but it's more complicated than that.
It is. So Gladwell helped popularize this idea that had been around for several decades of deliberate practice. And he emphasized this notion that people who become world-class at complex skills, almost without exception, have spent about 10,000 hours doing deliberate practice. But there's complications when you actually ask about how can I apply this to my own life. I think one complication, which is maybe bad news, and one that's good news. So the bad news complication is that deliberate practice is a very specific type of work, and it's hard. And the main researchers like Anders Ericsson who work on this make it clear simply doing something a lot is not going to make you better. You will quickly hit a plateau. So just because you've had the same job for 10 years doesn't mean that you become world class. It actually has to be this painful, uncomfortable straining of your ability if you want to get better. But the good news complication is when we're talking about a field like knowledge work, where we do not have these sort of fixed competitive structures and sets of rules, in order to actually get ahead of your peers, to get ahead of your coworkers, to start standing out in your field, in most cases, you need way less than 10,000 hours of this training work before you start to see positive returns. And that's because almost no one is doing this type of work. I've profiled people that have spent 4 months doing this type of work in, say, computer programming and getting massive returns from it, right? So this is the good news, bad news, deliberate practice. It's harder than people think, but in most fields, if you're not a chess player, musician, or athlete, you can start to get rewards from it way sooner than it takes to become a grandmaster.
Just because of less competition.
It's less competition and less structuring of the rules. If you have really clear rules, okay, what matters is, how fast you run around a track. What matters is, here's the rules of chess, and if you get the checkmate, it's much easier to build focused practice strategies. But if you're a financial consultant, well, wait a second, what are exactly the rules? What are the right skills to improve? How do I isolate the skills? None of that's obvious. So if you put in that effort, you'll be one of the only people doing it.
I've seen you make the statement, don't follow your passion, cultivate it. I'm sure some people out there listening will say, well, Mike, that sounds like Cal, that sounds like a cliche, but what you're talking about in our conversation right now is the idea of cultivating it. It is the idea of how you dig deeper and look at passion from a different vantage, not just and I'm not just picking on Oprah, but I think Oprah would be a classic case of bringing people into a studio audience, riling them all up and saying, go follow your passion. And then the detail, the deliberate practice, etc., is missing in action.
Yeah, I think cultivate is the right verb. So to use an analogy, imagine that your goal in your working life was to make a certain amount of money. You say, my big goal is that I want to be making, $200,000 a year is my goal in my working life. Well, you would see that as something that you had to work on over time. You would have to deploy lots of strategies, and it would be a long-term process in which you're trying to build towards a place where you are making that much money. Well, passion should be thought about analogously. It's something that you're building towards in your career, and it's going to require multiple strategies working together combined with long-term plans. It's something that is cultivated over time. It is not an intrinsic trait. It is not something that is like your eye color or your blood type that you just need to do the right strength finders test and you'll identify. It is a side effect. It is a goal. It is something that you have to build towards deliberately over time.
How did you have this awakening, this aha moment to kind of connect these dots that looking at, because like I said, I think it's so fascinating that in my life, I wanted to acquire the skill. I wanted to learn those things. And I'm sure I was motivated, but the passion didn't come till after. So what was your breakthrough to kind of have your aha moment about this angle of this subject?
Well, there's the informal breakthrough and then the formal breakthrough. So informally, this had always sort of intuitively made sense to me. When I was in high school, this was back during the first .com boom, back in the late 1990s, I had started a technology company with a partner, and we had quite a bit of fun, making a lot of money and leaving school to go close deals, these sorts of things. And it gave me a sort of entrepreneurial mindset at a young age. I had this notion by the time I was coming to college that life is something that you control and steer towards things that are interesting. Technology entrepreneurship was not something that had been on my radar until it was, and it led to something interesting. It wasn't pre-planned, it led to something interesting. And that's just the way I saw life, right? Yeah, if you want interesting things in your life, you want your career to be cool, earn it, work towards it, build something that's going to be interesting. So I've always had this informally in my mind. So when I went to graduate school, for example, I said, yeah, it's going to be hard, but you know what? If I do this well, cool things will happen down the line, which they have. The formal awakening is when I said, okay, I am now going to research this topic. And it was at a time, a major career transition. I was about to enter the academic job market. And I said, before I take what might be a job for life, this is the time in my life where I want to formally research how do people end up loving what they do, just to make sure that are my intuitions correct? Am I missing something? And that's when I hit the road and more systematically studied this topic. And that's what really clarified these informal intuitions that I had had for many years. It helped me really pin down and be very clear. Okay, when you look at 10, 20, 30 different people who love what they do, here's the pattern you see. Here's what matters. Here's what doesn't. So I informally had always sort of had these type of ideas, but it's only when I started writing a book on the topic that I could clarify them.
Have you ever pondered for your own experience? Have you pondered how having that entrepreneurial success at a young age was a huge advantage? I think some of the best traders in my world are, and I sometimes just wonder how they had the insight, but it's the guys that start the track records at 22, 23, 24, and they get into their early 30s and they've got a 6 to 10 year track record, and it's that time element that you can't get back. And so I think it's really interesting that you had the entrepreneurial success come into your life early. Have you looked into the idea of because look, we're in a day and age where if you turn on the TV, everyone's just talking about a jobs, and look, you live in Washington D.C., the politicians, jobs. That's not how entrepreneurs make it. You don't wake up worried about whether somebody in D.C. is talking about a job. So I'm really curious if you might add some thought about getting some of these entrepreneurial experiences as a young man.
I think this had a massively positive benefit on my life. And I think the timing is exactly why. The fact that I had these entrepreneurial experiences pre-college was crucial for my own thinking about careers, because it really is the college years where people, at least in America, young people, get indoctrinated in these certain ways of thinking about their life and happiness and passion and their career. Because I came into college with this sort of contrarian, autonomous mindset, I was like, well, I'm not, why do you think that's true, right? Who are you? Like, why is that true, right? I had this mindset. I was reading the business books, and it had this massive positive impact. Not that the entrepreneurship taught me, oh, here's the right way to think about your career, but it allowed me to not get caught up in just what the conventional wisdom was. And this was remarkably useful. I mean, when I showed up at college, for example, one of the first things I did was say, I don't like studying late at night. I don't think you guys are studying in a smart way. So let me go buy a business book about how to be a good student. Oh, they didn't exist. So I went and wrote my own, went out, researched, talked to Rhodes Scholars, talked to Phi Beta Kappa students, and had a 4.0 GPA, every quarter for the rest of my college career. Never worked past, say, 8 or 9 at night. Never pulled an all-nighter in my college career. So that was the type of mindset I was in at this time. You guys don't really know that much about what you're talking about. So I'm going to think for myself on these issues. And that's been a massive advantage.
I have to share with you. I've done close to over 180 podcast episodes. So the first time someone said they've never pulled an all-nighter, and I didn't really get much out of college, primarily because I had the entrepreneurial thinking, but I never pulled an all-nighter in college either. I thought it was silly, that was stupid, and I refused to be like half awake, after being up all night, losing out on sleep. When anybody can do some study of sleep and realize that if you don't have it, you're far from optimal.
Yeah, studying turns out not that hard, but college students make it into this very difficult, terrible ordeal, and they do it in a really inefficient way. And I say, I've been writing books for a long time, but a book I wrote in 2006 where I said, look, here's how the very best students study has sold a massive number of copies for exactly that reason. People just don't spend enough time to step back and say, why am I doing things this way?
I want to probe a little bit deeper on some of your early background, because you mentioned coming into school with some technology entrepreneurial success. How did you get there at a young age? Did you have an influence? Did you have an inspiration? Was it your own wake-up call? Was there some family inspiration, friends inspiration? What happened?
There wasn't. I mean, it's unclear to even me why this interested me, but I just had an interest. At a young age, I had an interest in two things. One, technology and technology businesses. I was the kid that was 15 years old and reading the sort of famous, Gates biography and biography on Apple Computer. For whatever reason, that just was interesting to me, and I don't know why. And the idea of running a business was interesting to me. And it's not that I was surrounded by entrepreneurs. I didn't have entrepreneurs in the family. But when the tech boom happened and it became clear that it was possible to start a company without having to have an office building, it just felt like this is something that would be fun to try. And that's exactly the way my partner and I thought about that. This would be interesting. Why don't we give it a try?
Well, I think it's a great point you make about the office building, because I had the same. I'm a few years older than you, but I was kind of coming along at the same time during the dot-com bubble. And my whole thought living in Northern Virginia at the time was like, wow, all this traffic is going to eventually go away, because who's going to commute anymore? 15 years later, the traffic is 10 times worse. And the lessons that you and I are talking about are no closer to the masses than they were 15 years ago. That what you just mentioned, that simple idea of, gee, you don't need an office.
Yeah. And I can attest the traffic, yes, is still bad. It's still bad in the DC area. But yeah, it's true. There were big ideas in the air back then. We were making our money, my partner and I, because we were early on the outsourcing strategy for technology. We ran a web design company in which we were outsourcing the actual programming and the actual design work to both India and Pakistan at a time where people weren't really doing that much, but the writing seemed to be on the wall that, wait a second, we can charge this rate, it's cheaper, and we can pay a much cheaper rate to developers doing it, and we'll put some of these resources into a very nice looking client extranet and a good experience with the client, and we'll show up in the boardroom in our suits and be young, and they'll think that they're hiring some prodigies, and it'll all be very exciting, but it was also immensely profitable. So it was a very exciting time, and a lot of the ideas that came out of it are now at the core of a lot of the business strategy that's bouncing around today.
I want you to address a few more things about passion, and perhaps talk about, there's going to be plenty of people listening, and they're going to, if they don't already have a feeling, maybe they're going to play devil's advocate in their mind like my assistant. But talk about the idea of, and this is kind of where I went at a little bit on her. Gosh, I know she's going to kill me for picking on her. But anyways, Anxiety and failure. I think a lot of this comes down to this fear of failure, the anxiety, because instead of dedicating yourself to something that's hard, instead of dedicating yourself to the deliberate practice, there's got to be a reason why people don't. And I think fear is a huge motivator, and people don't want to fail. So instead, they stay in like a suspended animation in some ways. Just imagining that they're going to, as getting back to the beginning of our conversation, I think they just sit there and just imagine that one day they're going to go, oh, I know my passion now. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, I think it helps. I think it helps to use this this metaphor I use throughout my writing about career capital, and it really changes the way people think about this quest to craft a good career. So in this metaphor, career capital is basically your store of rare and valuable skills. The better you are at things, the more valuable your skills, the more of this substance you have. And this is exactly what you invest to get the traits that build a passionate career. So if you want a lot of autonomy, you have to have a lot of career capital to invest for that autonomy. If you want a sense of impact or recognition or mission, you have to have a lot of career capital to exchange in return. Now, this makes the whole career process actually less scary because it's no longer predicated on massive moments, a big burst of courage in which you make a big change, or when you finally commit to leave law school to start your ice cream stand. You get rid of the momentous changes and say, no, what it's really about is the steady accumulation of career capital. So you don't have to make a big move. You don't have to put everything on the line next week to get started. You just have to say, how much career capital do I have? How could I increase the rate at which I'm acquiring it? And that seems more of a long-term sort of steady type plan. And it gets rid of a lot of the scary stuff. You know, it's not about dropping everything. It's about, hey, if I actually systematically worked on this particular skill in my particular job that people think to care about, if I do that for the next 6 months, that's going to give me a little bit more career capital. Oh, if I learn this skill over here, or I take on this project and figure it out, that'll give me a little more too. So maybe I'll do that as well. And that is not so scary anymore. You know, it's actually a very rational, sort of systematic way to build towards passion. No more of this, everything is big, momentous, scary changes. And I think that takes away a lot of anxiety.
It's also hard, though. I think it's hard for people to imagine what it's going to feel like when you have the passion from putting the time in to get the skill. So let's imagine the person sitting there without the skill or a limited version of the skill, and they have to look ahead to the future and say, I'm going to put all this deliberate practice in because I'm going to get this feeling, this passionate feeling on the backside. That's probably hard for a lot of people to accept.
This is very important because this is probably the number one worry/complaint I heard in response to my book, right? Was this notion that even if it's true that if you get really good at something, you'll end up passionate about your work, I don't see how you can persist through the time necessary to get good at something, to put in all that deliberate practice, unless you have some sort of pre-existing passion for that subject. This is the biggest complaint I get, that it all still comes back to passion. You can't put in 10 years getting good unless you love what you do. And what I want to really reassure people is that if you look at the research, if you go out there and do your own anecdotal case studies, what you find is that when it comes to skill development, passion snowballs along with the skills. It's not 10 years of drudgery and then you love your work. It's, I got better at this skill. I got some positive feedback for that. I like what I do a little bit more. That allows me to persist through the next stage of getting better, the next hard push for the next level of skills. And then I get rewards for that. And I love what I do even more. And as you get better, your passion grows along with you. So it's not a matter of, let me commit to this for a decade and then get my reward. It's, let me commit to this now and I'll start feeling the rewards in a few months.
Ponder it for a second, but we've talked about the example of chess. Are there any other specific examples that you might want to bring up? A particular individual, a particular group, something else that can give an example of the idea of deliberate practice, the idea of all concepts that we're talking about in our conversation today, something else in your work or an individual in your work that really either inspired you or helped you to make your case even more so?
Well, the big source of motivation for me that helped me start down this quest to solidify these ideas was the quote that ended up being the title of my book. And this was the quote from Steve Martin. And the history of the quote is he was being interviewed by Charlie Rose. And towards the end of the interview, Charlie Rose asked him, well, what advice do you give to aspiring entertainers who want a great career like you? And Steve Martin said, well, I always give them the same advice, but it's never what they want to hear. They want to hear, here's the secret to finding an agent, or here's the secret to getting your script noticed. But I tell them that the key is just to be so good they can't ignore you. And if you do that, good things will follow. And I love the clarity of it. I mean, the clarity of that really helped motivate me to say, okay, I want to understand this better, because basically he was saying, forget the gimmicks, forget the big breaks to come out of nowhere, forget I have some life hack strategy, the world is stupid, but because I'm somehow doing some clever thing with Google Ads or something, I can be monstrously successful tomorrow. So just forget all that. Become really good, unambiguously good, so good that people say this guy is great at what he does. And if you do that, good things will follow. You don't have to predict in advance what it'll be, but they will. And to me, that's very motivating. Be so good they can't ignore you, and good things will follow. And I think that sums up pretty well the reality of how people actually build up remarkable working lives.
Yeah, I think it's a great example with bringing up a comedian. I've heard I think I've mentioned this in my podcast, a great conversation between Jerry Seinfeld and Howard Stern talking about the craft and the time they put in and frankly, once again, building up skill. And I think I've seen quite a few comedians talk about that process and being on stage. And look, I'll give you a great example that happened to me this year. I've done more public presentations this year all across Asia. Never done the numbers that I've done this year ever before, maybe 3 or 4 a year. This year it's been like over 45. And something happens to you after doing that in front of so many thousands of people in frankly a short period of time. And I didn't even realize, but it's another great example of your work in action, doing the hard work. And then on the backside of it, now when I do presentations, it's not like I dial it in or think that I'm so cocky or so good now, but you just realize that, wow, okay, I've got a few more calluses for this skill, and I'm a little bit better at it. And then you become more excited to do even more. If someone gave me a stage every day, I'd take it. I think the directions that you're going are really smart directions and can really help a lot of people. And that's the primary reason that I want to have you on. Like I said, I feel like I've had a chance to live some of your research and just learn it firsthand, but I never really realized until I read how you had explained it that this had happened to me. And so it was this great light bulb moment of like, oh, that happened to me. But until I saw your words in print, I didn't realize exactly what had happened to me.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that experience. And I think the broader trend that's happening right now is that there was a major disruption and shift in the world of work, right, in America and other places as we shifted towards more of a knowledge work economy. So this meant we had to rethink the whole notion of career. It's very interesting to hear interviews with like Richard Bowles, who wrote What Color Is Your Parachute, these sort of original writers of the career advice guides for this new era. And they talked about how in the 60s and before, if you wrote a book that said, hey, you should sit down and figure out, what you want to do for a living, people, he said, would call you a dilettante. So we had this big transition into a new type of fluid career space where you had lots of options in what you did, and you didn't just stay at home and work in the plant nearby. And I think our first stab as a culture of figuring this out was to throw some cliches at it. Follow your passion, do what you love. And now we're shifting. It's as if our conversation is maturing and people are deciding, wait a second, this is way too important for just a few cliches from a guidance counselor. This is my whole life and career and livelihood. Let's talk about this like adults. Let's talk about this with phrases that, with high probability, will not show up in a Disney movie. That's what's happening now. I think that's the shift that's happening. I mean, my work is just one of, I think, a much larger conversation saying this is too important to just throw cliches at. Let's talk seriously about issues of work and satisfaction and passion.
I don't know if we're there yet. I think you're going the right direction. I don't know about the masses. I think the long tail, the outliers are right on board. We're ready to follow the logic of our conversation, but I don't know. We might have to agree to disagree. I don't know if the masses are anywhere close yet. I think the masses, they need a little bit more pain, perhaps a little more desperation to realize that it's not just about turning on the TV and listening to a politician tell you how they're going to create a job for you. There's so much of that language out there, and I think that probably far drowns out a lot of the types of conversations that we're having here and many of you and your peers are having. But I think eventually it's going to make a difference for sure. But you might disagree with me. You might see more progress, but I just think the masses are still a little immune to they still in this dreamland of a magical corporation or a magical government giving them a job and waiting for somebody to create them a job.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's true. I'm probably surrounded. I'm surrounded by the few. By definition, all the people I talk to are those who have liked what I had to say. I throw in another factor, though, that I think is also going to be positive, but right now is causing issues. I think as higher education is reimagined, we're going to see a lot of impact, probably positively, on the way that young people think about their careers. One of the issues that brought passion in particular to my radar is when I used to write college books, I would hear from so many college students who were unable to stick with a college major because they would get to the upper level courses and they'd be hard. And they say, well, this is hard. It must not be my passion. So let me change. 5-6 years later, they were still in school. That's where I was actually first introduced to the actual pervasiveness and perhaps insidious nature of passion. And if you think about it, the current sort of higher education system helps set this up because it's this notion of, here's these abstract topics and you're making a choice about, what your career is going to be and you have to choose properly to figure out what your passion is. I think as we see more a la carte, you're constructing a particular set of skills you think is going to be valuable in the marketplace. That's going to shift at a young age the way people think about passion. It's not, I choose a major and that's my destiny. It's, I'm going to learn this skill and this skill and this skill because I think this combination is going to be useful to that market. That's going to be a positive shift in our career thinking.
I think you're spot on. Cal, I'm going to let you run. Where can people find out more? Where's the best place for them to go to check out your world and your work?
CalNewport.com will get you where you need to go.
Okay. Hey, listen, I appreciate you coming on, and I think people will enjoy this conversation. I hope I don't sound like I've praised you too much, but I just think it's a really cool thing that in my life, I feel like I've lived this, and then you kind of wrote it down. So I always give people the props that I'm jealous of your light bulb moment. I'll be honest about it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, this book more than anything else is I've been getting that reaction quite a bit. I think there's a lot of people who are sort of frustrated with the simplicity of the conversation, but know that there's something more going on here, but it's just not where they're putting a lot of time. So they actually, by just taking the time to say, okay, let me figure out what this frustration is, I think I sort of was putting down on paper what a lot of people were thinking. A lot of people was on their, I should think about this more to-do list.
Yeah. Cal, take care, and hopefully we'll talk again in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.